Welcome to EV Hub Live. EV Hub Live is a live video podcast for public policy professionals working to advance transportation electrification. EV Hub Live is recorded live, so to tune in and ask questions or check the schedule, please visit atlasevhub.com/live. In this episode of EV Hub Live, Cassie Powers from the National Association of State Energy Officials and Geoff Morrison from Cadmus will join Nick Nigro to talk about the new PEV Policy Impact Rubric, which can be used by state and local officials to evaluate the strength of their PEV-related policies, and to discuss how the policy community can answer that critical, ever-changing question, what's working? This episode is produced by Peter Benzoni of Atlas Public Policy.
Hey, welcome. Really excited to be here with Cassie and Geoff. We're going to get right into it. So tell us about this rubric. Who's the audience? Why did you make it? And I'm particularly interested in what the role of Electrify America is in this. So Cassie, why don't we start with you, and then we'll go to Geoff.
Sure. Thanks, Nick, and thanks to you and the Atlas team for inviting us to join today. We're excited to share some information about this new resource from NASEO and Cadmus. As was explained in the introduction, the Plug-in Electric Vehicle Policy Impact Rubric is a tool that state and local governments, as well as utilities and others, can use to self-assess the strength of their jurisdiction's electric vehicle policies. The tool divides the large suite of EV policies into 13 different policy categories, ranging from vehicle purchase incentives down to education and awareness campaigns and everything in between. And so a jurisdiction can go in there, take a look at what EV policies are currently in place, see what they might want to do to improve the electric vehicle market through policy design in their jurisdiction. And so there are a few more things we can certainly share about that. But Geoff, I'll turn it over to you if you'd like to offer any comments before we get into some of the details.
Sure. Thanks, Cassie. And thanks so much, Nick, for having us on. It's pretty awesome to be on your podcast. I've been listening to every episode, and I've listened to the one with Dan Sperling, I think 3 times. There's so many little gems in that. Yeah, really great to be here. As Cassie said, this rubric is it's really for that decision maker at the city level, or at the utility level, or at the state level, or really any sort of related stakeholder, to just get a general sense of how they should be prioritizing different electric vehicle policies. And I should note it's only focused on light duty, this rubric, so that's pretty important. And I think it's you'll find it to be relatively simple to look at. It's about 4 pages long, and invite you.
Peter, can we pull up that first one there, the first page of it? Yeah, very, very nice layout there, guys. Very impressive. Very easy to read. Well done. Go ahead,
one of the things we wanted to do was try to streamline this rubric this time around. So you had asked about the role of Electrify America. Electrify America was the group that initiated this rubric. And so they brought NASEO and Cadmus on in 2018 during their Cycle 2 investment planning process, because they wanted to consider what a jurisdiction's suite of EV policies looked like as one criteria in their decision to invest in a jurisdiction. And so we created a first version of this rubric in 2018. And when Electrify America started their Cycle 3 investment process, they brought us back on to do an update, and we were very happy to do that. The policy environment, the EV markets changed a lot in the last couple of years, and so we think that this resource really could stand to be updated quite often, seeing as how things change quite rapidly.
I believe it. So you guys are helping steer $2 billion worth of investments here, it sounds like.
Well, we are one factor in that investment.
Okay.
Yeah. But it's nice when you say it like that.
Sure.
And I mean, to be clear too, Electrify America did a great job in terms of sort of just, they did fund this, but they basically just told us to develop it.
And ask.
And so it's
they have their hands in there, or what? Or hands off?
Yeah, no, I mean, it was really like, I mean, they told us repeatedly, you guys need to be making the decisions and the final calls on how this is organized, and also kind of, what the weighting is between different categories. So I thought they did a great job there.
And one of the things, if I can just offer a little bit more of the details on the rubric too, Electrify America was really interested in making sure that this was grounded in research as well as input from the experts. And so when we were developing this, NASEO and Cadmus reviewed literature from academic journals, as well as prominent nonprofit organizations, et cetera, to try to get good information about what was really the most effective policies at advancing EVs. And we also convened a technical advisory committee with 13 different EV policy experts from academia, nonprofit organizations, state and local government, to help inform and provide a gut check on some of the assumptions that we had used during this research. And if you can bring back up that slide, Nick, for the first one, we have divided, as I mentioned earlier, the entire suite of EV policies into 13 different categories. And that was really based on what we learned in the research, what we heard from the experts. At the bottom of the page, then you'll see that the policies that are really deemed most effective as standalone policies are in that tier 1. Those are vehicle purchase incentives and vehicle adoption standards, like the ZEV standard in California. And then the next most effective grouping of policies are in that tier 2, mostly having to do with EV infrastructure help. And then tier 3 really captures the rest. And each of these are assigned a different weight. And so a user can take a look at these policies and say, I've got policy X, Y, and Z. I can assign a weight to that based on what the criteria say in the rubric, and then can understand really how strong my suite of policies are. And importantly, they can also see what might be appropriate for them.
Very cool. And so let's talk a little bit about the tier 1. Why?
Sure.
What, I mean, I guess it's kind of obvious or self-explanatory why they're so important, but tell us, walk us through that process of how you guys decided the weights and this sort of complex undertaking. Cause I will say that it's something, we've seen a lot over the years in policy, and it's hard. It's hard to get this right. And, I think it's important that, we understand some of the behind the scenes methodology.
Absolutely. Geoff, do you want to chat a little bit about some of the research? Cadmus was really the lead on that.
Yeah, sure. For those first two policy categories, I will say, so vehicle purchase incentives, I think there's a general sentiment among the EV community that those are impactful policies. And so it's more of a how impactful relative to everything else are those incentives. And out of kind of all the literature that's out there, there's probably most written about EV purchase incentives. It's a fairly easy thing to study because you have a dollar amount that's applied in different locations, and so that allows you to kind of tease out impact in a way that some of the other policy categories, like say education and awareness, it's just a little harder to kind of get an accurate estimate on. But yeah, I mean, I think the consensus in the literature is vehicle purchase incentives are very impactful, and there's a ton of studies that show that.
I gotta pick your brain a little bit more on these points. You got points. We're showing the slide here that talks about how you guys figured out what points to assign to different incentive values, that sort of thing. So how did you guys figure that out and decide how you were going to do that calculation?
Yeah. So it is, I mean, basically no study gives you this exact breakdown, right? So there's a little bit of an art and a little bit of a science, but I mean, they are kind of rooted in the sort of real world experience in the literature. There's really a lot to talk about, but the maximum point value there, if you're just looking at that top vehicle purchase incentive category, you would score that by saying, okay, my jurisdiction has a $3,000 vehicle purchase incentive. So you'd go to that little table in the upper right, and you'd get a certain amount of points for that 3,000. And then in the table at the bottom of that first category, there's some point adders you get for equity and for the sort of longevity of the policy. So you would add those on, and the maximum you can get in that first category is 20. And so it's really a compilation. I mean, I can't answer that exactly. There's probably 20 papers we reviewed to kind of feed into that. And we did multiple rounds of iteration with this technical advisory committee who weighed in on that. But Cassie, do you want to add anything? And I don't know if it's worth here talking about that equity component too, because that became kind of
I'm curious about where that came from. If that was a newbie to this process, or was that in the original?
No, so it was definitely a new addition to this iteration of the rubric. And so equity was something that we knew was important to incorporate into the rubric. This is something that state energy offices and state governments are really grappling with, how to make sure that they are designing equitable policies and programs. And that's particularly true in the EV infrastructure space and the EV policy space. And so one of the challenges we faced is that the rubric is really based in the literature that looks at how effective policies are. And there's very little literature currently available that gauges the effectiveness of equity-based EV policies. And so we had multiple conversations with our technical advisory committee, who agreed that it was important to recognize the role of equity in policies and how it might influence EV purchases. And so we did a couple of things. One, as you saw on the screen, we included an equity adder for the vehicle purchase incentive category, which allowed jurisdiction to essentially gain additional points within that category if there was an equity criteria or part of their EV policy, of their EV purchase incentive policy. And then there were two other policy categories that also have an equity component. One is the education and awareness campaigns, and another is the residential and PEV rates. And I don't think that we have those on our slides, but they can be seen on the rubric online.
Got it. Okay. So equity was one thing that was added. Let's talk about some other things that changed from 2018. And before you do that, just can we clarify too that, Electrify America, you said, funded this. They've been using it to figure out how they're going to spend $2 billion. But this document's public, right? Anybody could download it from their website.
Absolutely. So it's actually available on the NASEO website and the Cadmus website. This is a NASEO and a Cadmus product. And so It was used by Electrify America. And however, this is publicly available. We imagine it'll be useful for state governments, local governments, et cetera.
Okay. And then, So let's go into what's changed. Like how did the world change from 2018 to 2021? Obviously, we all know lots of stuff has changed since then, but specifically in the rubric.
Sure. So there are a number of things. One is a lot of the policy categories are still in this iteration of the rubric that were in the 2018 version. Some of the weighting has changed a little bit. One is that vehicle purchase incentives and bindings of standards are now of unequal weight. There was kind of consensus that both of those policies are highly and close to equally impactful. I think another thing is one of the things I'd like to emphasize is that 3 of the 4 policy categories in this tier 2 have to do with EV infrastructure investment and support. And so there's an EV infrastructure investment category, there is a commercial PEV rate category, and then there's also a streamlined permitting codes and zoning ordinances category. And all of those, while they each individually are 10 points, not quite as much as the vehicle purchase incentives, oftentimes jurisdictions will take on 2 or 3 of them, which can be highly impactful. And I think that that's part of it, is that there's a growing recognition that EV infrastructure investment is an appropriate role for government and is also something that is going to be needed. You talked about kind of what's changed, and it's funny, this research was largely wrapped up by the end of the last calendar year. And of course, a lot has happened in the past 3 months. I mean, GM hired Will Ferrell to do a primetime commercial for EVs at the Super Bowl. That's a big deal. And I think signals that we're already in a different environment. And so things are changing pretty rapidly.
Geoff, what jumped out to you that's changed between 2018 and 2021?
Yeah, I think, we had a lot of discussion with this technical advisory committee about dealership programs. That was one thing that was not explicitly in the last rubric. And there's, definitely widely considered a bottleneck automotive dealerships in terms of actually getting more EVs on the road. However, the maximum point value for that for dealership programs is still relatively low, because there wasn't a great amount of evidence that is like, the number one or number two policy out there.
Mm-hmm.
So
when it comes to like adding this stuff up, just because I'm not as an expert in the rubrics as you guys are, like, so if I had a couple of policies that were infrastructure based, and my policy that was vehicle incentive based, so I'd be just adding them all up, and my score is like the max. So if I have multiple infrastructure policies, that could be more valuable to the market than an individual vehicle policy. Is that what you guys were saying?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And we can show an example. Maybe Peter, you could show the example scoring. That might help kind of orient people.
There you go.
Yeah. So it is, it's a little overwhelming when you first look at it, but hopefully, after you do it once, it's really pretty simple. There's 13 policy categories, which you see listed over there on the left-hand side. In the next column, there is kind of the maximum score you can get for each one of those 13 categories. Mm-hmm. And that maximum score, like we said, is kind of the weight or the sort of the importance level of a policy in terms of pushing more EV sales. So then this is just for like a fake city, New York. It is actually based on a real city in New York. See if you can guess. But so the next column over to the right is the score that fake city, New York gets out of the maximum there. Mm-hmm. And the final column is just kind of like a set of notes based on like, we've got this policy and it's this strong, or we don't have this policy, et cetera. So it's just kind of, keeping track. So all you do is, you literally sum your score, which is shown at the very bottom there. So they get like a 47 out of 100. And, Cadmus did a lot of work where we were kind of looking at different metro areas across the US using this rubric. And, a score of 47 is kind of right in the middle of the jurisdictions we were looking at. Some of the more kind of forward-leaning jurisdictions were up in the 70s or 80s in terms of score. We didn't want to just give any jurisdiction the stamp of approval and say like you've made it. So like no jurisdiction got like 100 that we evaluated. There's always room for improvement, kind of everywhere. So
got it. So we talked about what's changed, what's emerging as an issue or opportunity that came out of this research that we should be aware of that came out of the process.
Sure. So we talked a little bit about the kind of importance of infrastructure incentives. I think that part of that too is that there is a good chance that there will be a federal infrastructure job stimulus package at some point this year, which might help to provide support funding for installing EV chargers. The president set a 500,000 EV charging station goal. And so I think that one of the things that's changed is that the first rubric was really about the vehicles, focused almost entirely on the vehicles. And that is still the goal of this, or rather the lens that we looked through when creating this rubric, is what policies were most effective at advancing electric vehicle adoption. But what we're seeing now is that the charging infrastructure really needs to get in the ground in order for EVs to take off. And so I think that was a big thing. One other item that isn't so much emerging, but that we did want to flag, is that there was a lot of discussion around the effectiveness of policies to support education and awareness campaigns. This is something that the literature doesn't say a lot on. There isn't a lot of literature that shows that education and outreach policies lead to more EV sales. But we've heard from the Technical Advisory Committee again and again, both in the first iteration of the rubric as well as the update this year, that education and awareness policies are important. And I would not be surprised if in the coming year there are more studies that show how effective those policies are.
Geoff, what about you?
So it's sort of been mentioned by Cassie, but I think there's this general recognition about vehicle purchase incentives, not to, go back to an earlier topic, but, as the cost of electric vehicles comes down very rapidly, the sort of impact from those vehicle purchase incentives is going to be dampened. And, in a few years, we may not need any vehicle purchase incentives, hopefully, for that sort of vehicle decision choice that's happening at the dealership. And so if that goes down in importance, then some of these other things go up in importance. And specifically, there's a lot of categories in this rubric that are either directly or indirectly related to the infrastructure piece. And so that infrastructure piece, as Cassie said, really rises in importance. And we haven't really talked about the vehicle standards, like the ZEV mandate type incentive category. But we did have a lot of discussion with the technical advisory committee about just kind of how important that policy is going forward. And I think there's this recognition that it's not just sort of changing the behavior of automakers, but it's also changing the entire sort of ecosystem within a state by adopting like a ZEV standard. So you get more advertisements. If you have a ZEV standard in your state, you might just get just better, higher quality sort of communication and just more sort of peer effects from one person to another when there's this really strong state level policy in place.
So I want to channel my industry friends here. I'm sure that they would say, well, but like you can't just do the ZEV standard and expect to get wide scale EV adoption, that sort of thing. Do you guys have a thought that you want to share about when it comes to the combinations of these different policies? You've got the scoring mechanism you talked about with where you're just adding them up, but like how could a state or a municipality or whoever could be implementing some of these policies look at the importance of adding them together, complementary policy, that sort of thing?
Yeah, well, I think that you've hit it on the head, is that there are certain policies that are infeasible for many states and jurisdictions. I mean, plug-in electric vehicle purchase incentives and the ZEV standard is really tough for most states right now, especially in this era of constrained budgets. We are in a time where the states are reeling from the impacts of COVID and are focused on recovery. And because of that, spending money on an EV purchase incentive often isn't in the cards. And so that automatically takes out that tier one for a lot of states and cities. But then that's okay. States can say, okay, we can't do that right now, but let's take a look at the tier two policies and the tier three policies. And it might be tough for us to put a lot of money towards EV infrastructure investment right now, but we do have the funds from the Volkswagen settlement and some other funds that we might be able to scrape for that. We can also talk to our utility about what they might be considering to mitigate the demand charges on EV infrastructure, and streamline permitting. That's one that's often overlooked, but can be a low cost option that can make a really big impact and help to attract investment from EV infrastructure companies.
I wanted to ask about that. You brought up the utility, in a lot of what I think the target audience for this rubric is government, but clearly in a lot of jurisdictions, you've got utilities who are leading the way with incentives and such. Do you think that they can be using this rubric in the same way that your target audience government is using it?
Yes, absolutely. I think that a lot of these policies either can be implemented by the utilities, or utilities can, of course, be aware of and understand how their rate structures and other activities might benefit from a strong policy environment. And so, yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Jeff, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of different ways you could use this, and it's definitely meant for basically any decision maker who's in charge of programmatic decisions or programmatic funding within their organization. So utilities, regional bodies, city governments and state governments, or even the federal government. And, I think it could be used in a variety of ways. If you wanted to sort of benchmark yourself against other similar entities, so a utility benchmarking itself to another utility who's maybe very progressive, you could do that. Or you could simply look at the sort of the different maximum scores in each category and say, it seems like we could get more points here, by doing X, Y, Z. Let's put more of our focus here than here. I think it's really meant for those decision makers who have a general sense of importance of different policies, but want something in their back pocket that they can pull out that's it's truly evidence based and it's been vetted by literally the best minds. Our technical advisory committee. I'm not sure you could find a better technical advisory committee than we had. So
I don't think anybody at Atlas was on that, so I'm not sure.
we sent you an invite, but didn't get it. Yeah.
So speaking of competitiveness and being able to line states up against each other, have you guys talked with anyone about trying to implement the counting essentially of the scores by state and just trying to see how states stack up against each other and kind of surface those results?
Yeah, so we actually don't see this as a tool for ranking states against each other. That's something that NASEO doesn't do, and we think that I know, but that's also something that we think just isn't necessarily the most productive use of this type of a tool. We think that what this brings to the table is it shows how impactful one policy is against another. And so if I'm a state, I have a limited amount of money, I have a limited amount of bandwidth, I can look at this quickly and say, I think that my state adds up to about a 20 or a 25 with our current policies, but I think I can do this one and get us to that next level.
Okay. Yeah, I've always been kind of a healthy skeptic of grading policy effectiveness. I've been, Atlas has been asked to review similar kind of efforts before to rank in the ranking thing. And I tend to agree with you about the, competitiveness is great if states want to compete against each other, racing to the top sort of thing. But sometimes it can also be, a deterrent for action in some cases. It depends on the situation. So, but more so for me, the part that makes me a little nervous about grading and stuff is the assigning of the scores, and for some of these things, especially when you get into how specific you can be with the scoring. So this is a question mostly for Geoff here. How did you address that challenge in your process?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a tension between just being too specific and not specific enough. I mean, that's a pretty general answer, but at the end of the day, like Cassie said, there's people who have to make real decisions. And Nick, you probably get asked all the time. I get asked all the time by these decision makers, should I put, $1 million to this program and $2 million to this one, or vice versa? And, just doing kind of a hand wavy response is insufficient. This gives some sort of meat to help make those types of decisions. But I totally get your point, and that's why we tried to do a combination of both the sort of the latest academic literature from the last 3 years, as well as this technical advisory committee, and kind of those two together allowed us to be as specific as possible in the grading, or in the rubric design, I should say. So go ahead, Cassie.
No, sorry. I was just going to add a final point to hammer that home, is that we do think that this is a good tool, one that states can use to kind of understand, again, how effective certain policies are. But while absolutely understanding that EVs are not the top priority of a government right now, public health is, and security, and keeping the lights on. And there are energy considerations, environment considerations, all sorts of goals and targets that states are working towards. And EVs are one component of that. And so we imagine that a state who is trying to figure out whether to put $2 million here or $2 million there are going to be weighing a lot of different things. But if they've decided we are going to put $1 million to EVs, then that's where this type of a tool is helpful.
So Geoff, you brought up the academics, so I have to ask about research and what's next, what's gaps, what are the kind of gaps you found in the literature that all the academics listening to this should run to their funders and do a new paper on?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I should say, relatively new field. EV's been around for like 10 years now, the modern EVs, I should say. And so that's about as long as we have like a really good, solid observational studies on EVs. And I should be clear when talking about the rubric, we're looking at the impact of a policy on EV adoption. Like that's the link we're trying to make when we're reviewing the literature. So you apply a policy and you get some impact on EV adoption. There's a lot of other impacts that policymakers may want to consider, like emissions, cost effectiveness, disadvantaged communities. And so this rubric is really solely focused on that EV adoption piece. So, ideally, to measure a policy impact, you'd have to have some sort of experimental design where you have like a treatment and control, and sometimes that's right called a policy case and a counterfactual. Yeah, right. And so like if you're testing a new drug or a vaccine, they have a pretty standard randomized controlled trial that they do that type of experimental design. And the issue is in the transportation world, it's really hard to do kind of that true experimental design with the a randomized controlled trial. So there's a bunch of workarounds there, and there's some econometric techniques you can use. But I would say kind of the biggest gap, there are some papers out there, but I think there could be a lot more where they basically try to replicate that sort of like drug vaccine experiment in the real world. And so, I mean, that's really the only way you can say this policy has a causal impact. Everything else is, I think it's supporting evidence. So you can ask people, before a ride and drive, before a ride and drive, you can ask them like, do you want to buy an EV? You can ask them after the ride and drive, do you want to buy an EV? And you can see some difference there. But that's, those are a very select group of people going to those ride and drives. And do you really trust what they say on that day? And should that answer really be informing our policy? There's other ways to do this, like I said, in an experimental design. That's just a much stronger, more rigorous way to do it. So anyway, we need to, like, as a community, focus more on that experimental design. And I think we'd have this like evidence-based policy making down.
Cassie, what are your thoughts on things like gaps that when you were doing this work and helping lead this work, gaps that you identified that you think we need to have filled in by either the policy research community or just anyone involved in this space?
Sure. Well, I think that one of the biggest challenges is that, as we had mentioned earlier, we are working with research on what has proven effective, but not research on what is going to be needed to get to our EV deployment goals and what might work with what's expected to be the change in the market in the coming years. And so with that in mind, I think that projections that show what policies might be appropriate if EV deployment gets to a certain percentage by the end of the year, if a massive amount of funding comes through the federal government, how to spend that quickly, if medium and heavy duty technologies take off rapidly, how should states consider shifting their priorities from the passenger vehicle sector to the heavier one? Should they do that? That's certainly something that a lot of our members of state energy offices have been asking. Now, this project obviously focuses on passenger vehicles, but I imagine that there's going to be need to expand that to look at the heavy duty space.
Yeah, you've got my support for getting funded to do the medium heavy duty version of this, you too. Okay, so let's close out with a final question on, presumably you'll be rehired or you'll get funding from some other source to go do this again in a couple of years. Let's look into our little crystal balls here and see what do you think is going to matter? Geoff earlier brought up the fact that EVs are approaching a bit closer to price parity by then, maybe. There's going to be other issues that are emerging. You mentioned earlier that equities emerged as an issue now. What do you see coming into the future that you really want to be paying attention to?
Good question. I think that the equity component is going to be huge. I think that if we do this again in a year or two, equity is going to be much more prominent than it was in our version right now. And so that's a big one. I think also, though, that as the infrastructure really starts to get in the ground, there's going to be a lot more discussion about what distribution system upgrades are needed, what backend upgrades are needed, and what other policies there are that need to support that. Right now, we have our category on commercial EV rates, which covers the demand charges. But is that it? We should probably be talking about more than that. How does stationary storage and distributed generation play into helping to kind of iron out some of those rate considerations? So I imagine that the back end is going to be a focus.
Yeah.
Anything you want to add there, Geoff?
Yeah. Let's see, a couple of thoughts. We were talking to CARB a couple of weeks ago, and they brought up
California Air Resources Board.
Yeah, Air Resources Board. They brought up the landlord-tenant rights issue, installing charging, and who's paying for the charging on a monthly basis, and that's going to become really important, I think, moving forward to kind of have policies aimed towards that. We don't have anything about the landlord-tenant issue in the rubric, but I think just in general, jurisdictions are getting much better about targeting policies. So not just kind of applying like an incentive to buy an electric vehicle, but like targeting it to specific groups. And I think that's sort of the direction we're going, because the big concern is like the free rider problem. You have people taking incentives that don't actually need them. It ends up making these programs a lot more expensive than if you just have targeted people who where that incentive is really changing behavior. That's the direction we're moving, I think.
Bigger, sounds like a bigger tent for electrification in the next few years. Yeah, that's what everything looks like where we're heading right now, especially in the medium heavy duty space, which hopefully you guys will get to be able to do that next. Well, that brings us to the end of the show. I just want to thank my guests, Geoff Morrison from the Cadmus Group and Cassie Powers from NASEO. It was a really great discussion. You can download their rubric online, either their organization's websites. It's free to use, and please, send them feedback on what you think they should be doing next time. And as for us at EV Hub Live, we'll be doing another episode pretty soon. So stay tuned. Thanks for joining. Bye, guys. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Nick.
All right. Thanks, Nick.